Okay, everybody, we're going to pick up from where we left off last time. We had been speaking about the leadership of Crescentius of Jesi, who became Minister General after the death of Hamo of Faversham. And so we had the beginning of the Spirituals, who were the friars who were looking to live the rule radically, literally. They were formerly known as the Zealots, and the new nickname is the Spirituals, based upon the rule of St. Francis, where he talks about those who cannot observe the rule spiritually should have recourse to the Minister General. The spiritual, remember, in their day and age, spiritual meant literal observance, where today it's more of like we somewhat kind of follow it. Back then it was clearly a spiritual was someone who wanted to follow it literally. And then we talk about the exposition of the four masters. We had these four friars from the University of Paris, these masters of theology who were going to answer questions about the rule. And they sought to resolve to which of the evangelical councils were the friars to adhere. Was there not a danger, be it to the pure observance of the rule or the good name of the order in accepting privileges? What should be understood by the words necessity, shoes, vileness of clothing, pecuniary matters, money, intermediary? Was it allowed to make provisions to have recourse to spiritual friends for necessities for other than the sick and clothing? Could friars receive raw goods which, acquired by their labors, might be exchanged for other necessary things? To whom did furnishings belong? Was it permissible for the friars to sell, buy, borrow, exchange, give, pawn, or have fixed revenues from fields and vineyards? How far did poverty go? Was the general chapter above the minister general? What did it mean to observe the rule spiritually? These are the questions they were asking, and they were going to get to the bottom of it all, and they were going to solve everybody's problems, these great four theologians, these great masters, right? And they tried to draw this line between a counsel and a precept, something that we were advised to do, something we had to do. And what did they do? They just took the middle ground and didn't do much of anything at all. And they basically just referred, whatever the Minister General says. In some instances, they call them those papal definitions we already discussed of, covi longati. They really didn't do anything. They hoped to be some sort of great, presenters of great theology and solve all the problems, and the four of them wound up doing nothing at all. And they did say that the privileges are for the ill-willed and are an occasion to defame us. So that's kind of good. They kind of stood on that side regarding privileges, but these great four masters with their great exposition did about nothing, right? All right, so then Minister General Crescentius de Jesi, let's talk about him. So Crescentius was general from 1244 to 1247. 1244 to 1247. And he was also a physician and a renowned jurist. So again, he was one of the intellectuals who joined the order, and again, as we said, did not know Francis. And he was the provincial minister of Ancona. And he just continued the same work that Hamo of Faversham was doing. And he fought vehemently against division. He was trying to correct the laxities, but at the same time, he persecuted the spirituals. He obtained the papal bull Ordinum Vestrum. So the spirituals were so highly upset by this papal bull Ordinum Vestrum that they were going to plead their cause before the Pope. And the Minister General Crescentius found out with the spiritual about it, and so he seized 72 of the spiritual leaders. So you see, this was a big group. If there were 72 leaders, they're probably coming from the various provinces and groups of them. Crescentius had them seized, and with the permission of Innocent IV, he had them seized, and had them dispersed throughout the most distant provinces of the order. So he transferred them before they could get to the Pope. One of them, Angelo Clareno, who later would be one of the great spirituals, he called this the third persecution. The third persecution. Okay. Crescentius ordered Brother Thomas of Celano to write the Secundum Vitam. So that's one thing he did. That we have the second life of Thomas Celano because Crescentius asked him to. And so July 13th, 1247, he convoked a general chapter in Lyons, but he was too sick to attend Crescentius. Now, he did obtain this bull, Ordinum Vestrum, which was published by Pope Innocent IV, November 14th, 1245. Ordinum Vestrum. Ordinum, O-R-D-I-N-E-M, Vestrum, V-E-S-T-R-U-M, Vestrum, Ordinum Vestrum, Pope Innocent IV, November 14th, 1245. Okay? This is the second papal definition of the rule. The second papal definition of the rule. So this allowed spiritual friends for both necessities and conveniences. Remember, we had Cor Longati, which allowed spiritual friends for necessities, but now it's allowing it also for conveniences. It said that all the property of the friars was owned by the Holy See, unless it was personally owned by a benefactor or a spiritual friend. There was total exemption given to the orders, convents, and churches. Provincials could examine the preachers themselves, and this was to attempt to increase the apostolic work of the brothers. So the friars could be appointed in each province to receive novices. So this is what we have now, formation teams, I guess you'd have. Instead of the provincial receiving the novices or the general, it would be a particular friar assigned to that task. Permission was granted to recite their own office like other clerics. So they were allowed to have a particular office that was particularly to the friars. And so it was a little bit different than what Francis put in the rule about observing the divine office as is prayed in the Roman Curia. The custods, the provincials and the guardians, can appoint friars to take care of the clothing and need of the friars. And they're once again forbidden to enter the convents of nuns, particularly the poor clerics, right? Because they were chaplains to the poor clerics, but they were forbidden to enter the monasteries of nuns. Once again, that was confirmed. Now, this was followed up by a second papal bull, Quanto Studiosus, Q-U-A-N-T-O, Quanto Studiosus, S-T-U-D-I-O-S-U-S. Again, Pope Innocent IV, August 9th, 1247. So it was 2 years later. He follows it with another papal bull. And this gave a completion to Ordinum Vestrum, was to complete the previous document written 2 years earlier. So the provincials were permitted to appoint or replace the nunti, or the procurators, or the people who would hold the money for the friars, of the benefactors for the needs of the friars. Now this becomes dangerous because now these lay people who were given money by other benefactors to take care of the friars, if the friar doesn't like the person who's doing the distribution to the friars and getting them stuff for them, they can appoint somebody else. Or they can appoint the person they want, the friars, to take care of that. Where in the past, it was probably a member of the Third Order who just, out of the goodness of their heart, was doing it. And now the friars are going to officially appoint that person, which then leaves that control of those monies basically in the hands of the friars in this way. It's very dangerous. So it caused the friars to make great distinction between use and possession, as we said earlier. Here's the stuff we use, but we don't own it. The importance was turned from the friars having poor and lesser things to be able to claim absence of ownership, of communal ownership, despite the thing's worth or greatness. All right, so in the beginning you had few poor and necessary items that the friars didn't own, they just used. But now with this great distinction of use versus ownership, they began to get things that were not so few, not so poor, not so necessary. So they were having lots of things and saying, well, and nice things and things for convenience, not out of necessity, and saying, well, we don't own it, we just use it. And this line will be used throughout the centuries, even to our modern day and age, to say, well, we don't use these cars. We don't own these cars, we just use them. The order owns all of it, we just use it. This distinction between use and ownership was not in the mind of St. Francis. It's a complete aberration from what Francis intended. The Capuchin reform will go to the few, poor, and necessary, and go back to that, while the conventuals will continue to persevere in this, and also the observance eventually will fall into the, having many things, nice things for convenience, and say, well, we don't own it, we just use it. Okay? So the importance was turned from the friars having to the friars having and saying we don't own, having nothing, saying, well, we have this stuff, but it's not ours. So the General Chapter of Lyon in 1247. In 1247, Brother John of Parma was elected Minister General. When John of Parma was elected, Brother Giles, who was one of the first friars, he exclaimed, "You have come to us so much the better, but you've come too late. You've come too late." This reality that John of Parma was somebody who really knew the heart of Francis, but by the time he got there, all these changes were being made that had strayed the order away from the original rule of life. And John of Parma had a great love for studies, but more of a love for the ideals of Francis. He had a love for the studies and the intellectual, all the other stuff, but he was more in love with the ideals. He said, "The edifice of the order," this is John of Parma, "the edifice of the order rests upon two walls, knowledge and virtue." And John protested the amount of energy given to knowledge, that there was a lack of really striving for virtue. They say that John was humble, simple, firm, kind. He gave a good example of manual labor. So he wasn't just one of the guys sitting behind the desk doing the paperwork and reading and so forth and being above everyone else. He actually was doing the manual labor. So he sought to revive the primitive fervor and the primitive traditions. So you can figure the spirituals and the zealots were excited to finally have a minister general who understood the true heart of Francis and understood the charism and understood the ideals and had the ideals deep in his heart. He may have been one of those intellectuals, but he was one of those intellectuals who knew Francis from the interior of his heart. And so this was the man that they had been waiting for to become minister general. After everything they've been through with Hamo and Crescentius and John Parenti and Elias and the order straying away. And so here they are 20 years after the death of Francis, 21 years, 1247, 21 years after Francis's death. It's kind of like, here we go. We finally got a guy who's got it together, right? So what did he do? He held that the general chapters are to be held alternatively on the sides of the Alps to make it easier. So one time it'll be on this side of the Alps in Italy, the other side will be on this side of the Alps of Italy. This way it would be easier for the brothers, and everyone gets to share in the travels as time goes on. Now, John also believed that the Testament was the surest explanation of the rule. This made the spirituals very happy, that he felt that the Testament was the surest explanation of the rule. And he felt that the privileges they've been receiving, these papal bulls, did nothing but feed relaxations. And so he himself would examine candidates and not use the privileges or the delegations given to him. He was very careful to make sure he followed the rule himself personally. Now, something that none of the other minister generals have done so far is John actually visited every friary, and he went on foot, not on horseback, in the same way Francis used to travel about visiting all the friaries. Oddly enough, there was a large amount of privileges that were obtained during John of Parenti's time. John of Parma's time. But yet John would not make use of any of those privileges that were obtained, whether they were being given to the order or the other friars were trying to get them, but he wouldn't allow them to be used at that time. Okay. Now, there was a general chapter held in Metz, M-E-T-Z, Metz, in 1254. So you see, John of Parma was minister general for 6 years, right? 7 years, 1247 to 1254. So John of Parma, at that Council of Metz, the chapter, he completely renounced the papal bull Quanto Studiosos and suspended the application of Ordinum Vestrum wherever it contradicted Covi Longati. So he held the Covi Longati as an interpretation, and then he got rid of the other two, would not use them or accept them or allow them to be implemented. He rejected them. And, many of the friars are very, very happy with this, but the ones who liked the relaxations and the privileges were not very happy with John of Parma. So the friars who wanted relaxations and privileges tried to excite the friars against John of Parma. But it was kind of useless because everybody liked the guy. Like, he was such a good minister general, he was such a good person that when they tried to stage a coup against him, the intellectuals, yes, this is part of Franciscan life. It's part of religious life that when someone's in leadership, it's more than likely there'll be a group of people who don't like the leadership direction, and they'll stage a coup and try to overthrow the superior. and so they can basically do whatever they're going to do. But it's just typical. Anyway, they tried to stage a coup against John of Parma, but it didn't work. So they went after his weak point, and they accused him of heresy. So what was John's weak point? John of Parma favored some ideas of the heretic Joachim of Fiore, who was condemned by Pope Alexander IV on October 3rd, 1255. So Joachim of Fiore was a heretic. He lived in the year 1000. He was a monk, and he had this whole idea of that there was going to come a new age. There was the age of the Father, the age of the Son, the age of the Holy Spirit, and the age of the Holy Spirit was going to come, where there'll be no need for sacraments. There'll be the new everlasting gospel, whole bunch of stuff, and be issued in by the man who was marked by God, and so forth. And so there were some things about it he liked, other stuff he rejected. They kind of played around with some of the ideas back then. And but John he wasn't a Joachimist by any means. But because the friars who wanted to change things, who wanted to take control and power away from him, they decided to cause a little coup. And with their little coup, they went to the Pope and they accused him of heresy before the Holy Father. And I don't think Joachim had the opportunity to respond to it, because the Holy Father went to John of Parma and demanded that he resign and hand in his resignation. And the Pope had always been at odds with John of Parma, because the Pope wanted him to accept all the privileges that he was giving him, and John wouldn't accept them. And so the Pope wanted to enlarge the friaries and so forth, and the Pope was siding with these particular friars of the order, and so John was basically in a corner. Not much he could do. So on February 2nd, 1257, John of Parma held a general chapter. And when the general chapter assembled in Rome, Pope Alexander IV presided over the chapter. And so John, who convoked the chapter, resigned. And the friars would not accept his resignation. And since they could not persuade him to withdraw his resignation, they asked him to nominate somebody. And so John looked around and pointed towards a young friar who had just finished working on his degree and was preparing to teach at the University of Paris, one of John's former students, Bonaventure of Reggio. And so at that point, Brother Bonaventure, or now we know him as Saint Bonaventure, was elected unanimously by the entire body of the order, because John pointed to him and said, elect him. So John of Parma resigned to the friary at Greccio. And so if you go to Greccio, you'll see they have a lot of John's relics preserved there. He's considered a servant of God, John of Parma. He was a very holy, good man. And unfortunately, Bonaventure, who had been taught by John of Parma when John taught at the University of Paris, the new Minister General, St. Bonaventure, had to hold a trial for John to see if John was actually a heretic. It must have been very painful for Bonaventure to have to put his former professor on trial for heresy, especially since he was taught by him, right? So if he's wrong, I might be wrong, so you gotta be careful there. But in the end, John was exonerated. He didn't hold to the heretical views of Joachim of Fiore. He just playing with some of the ideas that were out there. So during this time, there was some further events and changes and developments in the order. This is where we see the development of the word conventual, right? The conventual Franciscans. There was a papal bull, cum tanquam veri, C-U-M, cum tanquam, T-A-N-Q-U-A-M, T-A-N-Q-U-A-M, tanquam veri, V-E-R-I. And this was published by Pope Alexander IV on April 5th, 1250. And the title of conventual convent, was given to churches and residences where there was sufficient number of friars to ensure divine services and large enough to hold general chapters. Now remember, the provinces have been increased to 72, and at the general chapters you would have each provincial, so 72 provincials, and then you would also have the representatives. So you're talking, 150 guys, because then you have other guys. It had to hold over 150 guys. And these became known as conventual convents or conventual friaries. Okay, so you had these tremendous friaries that got known as the conventual friaries. And from this point on, the word community, meaning those who were sticking with the more aberrations from Francis, these relaxations from the rule, the groups that held to the privileges, the groups that held to all these exemptions, and one of the big friars, they became known not as the community anymore, but now they're known as the conventuali, the conventuals. Okay, so you had the conventuals, the community, and then you had the observance. So we have two types of residences, right? The first is the conventual residence, the conventual friary, which eventually became used for all friaries except the smaller hermitage friaries. Now, hermitage friary is not meaning a guy living alone in a hermitage. A hermitage friary was a small community modeled on the portiuncula that was outside of the cities, okay? And the brothers had apostolic work and so forth, okay? But the conventual friaries had the right of election and eligibility to local chapters. The conventual title placed on the friary put it on the same level and honor as the most venerable congregation. So there was a sense of prestige that came with that title, conventual. And you could only get elected if you were a member of that conventual house. I mean, it became like almost a political way of running things, so that you keep the conventual or the intellectuals in charge, and the simple guys, the John of Parma guys, are not going to get back in office, right? So then we had non-conventual friaries. Eventually, the non-conventual friars would be the hermitage friaries. These are the ones, as I said, modeled on the portiuncula. A few friars, no more than 12, maybe at most 20. They were outside the city and, in mountains or the woods or in the fields, whatever. And they maintained the apostolic life and also the communal life, but in very simple, poor, humble ways. So we start seeing a division happening in the order, with these big, tremendous friaries and the guys who live there with a lot of exemptions and privileges. And then you have these smaller friaries where the friars are remaining faithful to the rule, faithful to poverty, faithful to few, poor, and necessary, where the big conventual friaries are staying faithful to rich, much, and convenience. Okay? So these are the distinction between the two friars we're talking about. So let's look at poverty and the means of sustenance in the 13th century. So when the friars would move from one friary to another, they would start bringing their belongings with them, moving the actual community from one place to the other. And Pope Alexander IV in 1255 allowed friars to sell friaries in order to purchase others. So although the friars didn't own the property or own the friary, now they could sell the friary and the property and buy a different friary and other property. Okay? An entire friary, including its possessions, or I should say, entire monastery, including possessions, was given to the friars by the cardinal protector. And the monks, as I mentioned earlier, were sent out of the friaries, out of the monasteries when this would happen. Okay? There was a general rule that the friars couldn't profit or keep the fruit from the land. They had fruit trees and stuff like this. They couldn't keep that. They had to give it to the poor, and they couldn't sell it, but kind of an understood rule that kind of fell away in time. But the friars could profit from alms destined for the repurchase of suffrages, with the exceptions of those of the Crusades. Legacies or inheritances made for pious purposes, but without any precise destination, up to a certain amount could be given to the friars. Foundations, inheritances, or deathbed gifts of so many measures of wheat, wine, wood, cloth, etc., which had to be supplied every year at a certain season, was given to the friars. A lot of this stuff was given at funerals in Franciscan churches, and so the friars were starting to collect that. There was a concession of indulgences to whomever contributed to the buildings of friaries or the livelihood of the friars. So if you wanted to contribute to the friary or to the livelihood of the friars, and you do, you get a certain indulgence. That was a real incentive for people to start donating to the friars and being good benefactors, good spiritual friends, because who wants to spend that time in purgatory, right? So, hey, this was an affront to poverty in many ways, because it was difficult to stay poor when people are pouring these gifts upon you. And then, to top it all off, you want to be a really good benefactor. Well, if you're really good, well, bury you in a Franciscan habit. And so this became part of a incentive to be a good benefactor, because then you get buried in the habit, little bene if you're a really good benefactor. So that was actually in a bull, papal bull, cum a nobis, C-U-M-A nobis, N-O-B-I-S. Pope Alexander IV. Again, you can see why he was having this tension with John of Parma, because John of Parma would not accept this stuff, but it was being pushed on them. And he wrote that in February 25th, 1250. February 25th, 1250, cum a nobis. And that gave the right for lay people to be buried in Franciscan cemeteries and with the habit. In 1255, Alexander IV forced the friars to accept a foundation for 6 friars that would be served by 2 servants. And the friars would have to beg. So think about that. He had a friary where 6 friars would live, and 2 friars, they would have 2 lay people as servants. So contrary to the life of Francis. You can see why John of Parma and Alexander IV were going head to head. And then came the papal bulls, 2 papal bulls, Docet et Expedit, Decet, D-E-C-E-T, Decet, et E-T, Expedit, E-X-P-E-D-I-T, Expedit, July 10th, 1253. And then just 6 days later, another papal bull, Dignum Existimamus, D-I-G-N-U-M, D-I-G-N-U-M, Dignum Existimamus, E-X-I-S-T-I-M-A-M-U-S, Existimamus, July 16th, 1253. And also, Alexander IV wrote both of them. And this authorized the Basilica of St. Francis to receive monetary alms as well as costly vestments. So now it authorized it. Now again, it's a papal basilica. Pope had a right to do that, but it was thrust upon them now to receive all this wealthy, rich stuff. However, the friars were forbidden to claim by right goods that were left to them. Basically, it was a legal fiction. Quo Elongati said it all belonged to Holy See, but it was all papal fiction. The friars had full control of everything. Not papal fiction, legal fiction. Thank you. The friars had control over everything. So then we had this procurator, right? The institution of the procurator. It did not suffice to say that the Holy See owned everything. They needed someone to administer the property, the goods, and the money. And the friars did not want to be involved in the transactions, sales, or purchasing of a friary or its expansion. To some degree. Most of the guys didn't want to be involved. So there was a procurator. This was a dedicated layman, or the nuncio, the nunti, as we mentioned, or a spiritual friend, who was entrusted with buying or paying of debts with the alms that the friars received from benefactors. Any goods or furnishings given to the friars automatically became the property of the Holy See. To buy or sell property, the procurator needed permission from the cardinal protector. Okay, that was when this all started, with this nunti, this nuncio, the spiritual friend, this benefactor would collect the goods of others, and then take care of the brothers. Eventually, the brothers had the opportunity to change that person out, whoever they wanted, and then that person needed to get permission from the Holy See to do the wheeling and dealing. But eventually, that just became, again, legal fiction. He was delegated to do everything he had to do. I mean, the Pope can't be worried about this type of stuff. The Holy See is not going to have to respond every time the friars want to do something. So it was just delegated to the nunci, or the nuncio, to do all that. The spiritual friend or benefactor was to provide for the ordinary day-to-day needs of the friars, while the procurator, the nuncio, was to administer the goods in the name of the church. So the papal bull Quantum Studiosus, August 19th, 1247, that we looked at, it gave the friars the right to name their own procurators and spiritual friends, as we mentioned. By the friars naming the person and not the Holy See, it risked the friars getting too involved with the temporal affairs of the transaction of goods. The privilege wasn't used for 30 years because John of Parma would not allow it. So although they had this, it was being pushed to the side. Okay. Princes and lords, in order to win the favor of the friars, exempted the procurators from paying taxes. So it was a good deal. If you became the procurator or the nuncio for the friars, you didn't have to pay taxes, because then the kings and the whatever princes were all in good with the friars that way. It was kind of this. The friars were well accepted. They were well loved by the princes and rulers and so forth. Some of them joined the Third Order. So, if the procurator, you work for the brothers, well, you don't have to pay taxes. You're exempt. Not a bad deal if you're working as the procurator, right? So other innovations. The friars began to employ secular servants. They were employing secular servants. This goes so contrary to St. Francis, who wanted the friars to be lesser, be the minors, be the servants. And here they are now hiring, I don't know how they paid them, maybe through the procurator, secular servants. And the secular servants were taking care of the manual labor in the friary, the work the brothers were supposed to be doing. Work priests who are friars should have been doing. And this was caused by the failure to recruit lay brothers. Because they weren't recruiting lay brothers, they would hire someone to be their cook, someone to do their cleaning, and the priests themselves were not doing the work. This clericalism set in and took the friars away from that charism where Francis wanted the friars, whether it be a priest or brother, to be doing the manual labor. There's a whole chapter on the rule. Chapter 5, the whole chapter is about manual labor. And it doesn't say anywhere that the priest should not be doing the manual labor. It's a fraternity, it's a brotherhood, it's a family, and they take care of each other. But with this clericalism that creeped in, that was no longer happening. Okay? They were not allowed in kitchens, I guess, the refectory, the infirmary, and these workers were forbidden to sleep in the friaries. That's good. Now, the institution of the procurator in the Roman Curia was something new. So now they had a person that was appointed to be working at the Holy See on behalf of the friars, obtaining these privileges. So you had the procurator, the nuncio, who took care of the needs of the brothers, the general needs of things, when it came to selling properties and stuff. Then you had the spiritual friends, who had benefactors, got the good things the brothers needed. And now you have this procurator working in Rome to get the privileges, kind of their canon lawyer close to the Holy Father, who can do the wheeling and dealing to negotiate things, obtain indulgences, and so forth. And this person would represent the friars during any quarrels that were happening with the diocesan clergy. And there were many quarrels with the diocesan clergy. So there were some statutes written by the friars in Narbonne. And that's the first time we see this procurator who's working in the offices for the friars, so the statutes in Narbonne first comes up. Then there was this other group called the Palatini. They used to nickname these guys the Palatinis, and these guys were the chaplains at courts and chaplains to kings. And these are the friars that lived all too willingly in palaces in order to be the chaplains of the kings or princes or dukes or whatever. The Palatini, meaning those who dwelled in palaces. So prelates and lords wanted the friars as chaplains because they were good, They were good men, good friars who served the church well. But it caused great problems in regular discipline in the life. They considered themselves outside of obedience because they worked for the king, or they worked for the duke, or they worked for some prelate in the church. They were their chaplains. Such a loss of the original charism of Francis, where Francis wanted the brothers to be poor and humble servants. So, the relations with the diocesan clergy and the professional chairs in universities. The clergy was starting to get a negative response to the friars. The diocesan bishops and priests felt encroached upon by the friars. But the universal exemption by bishops and priests, they felt slighted with the exemptions the brothers were getting. The bishops felt slighted. And they felt that the care of the faithful was for the diocesan priests, not for the friars to be taken care of on a day-to-day basis. And the friars did not take caution in reprimanding secular clergy. They're being a little bit too much attitude in how they were correcting priests. Some friars who left the order were still preaching and hearing confessions, and that gave a bad name to the order. So these privileges that they could preach anywhere, burials in friary churches and cemeteries, hearing anyone's confession, The opposition to privileges was just violent among the diocesan clergy and some diocesan bishops. In Portugal and Spain, some friars were emptied by order of the bishop. He threw them out of his diocese in both Portugal and Spain. So numerous were the complaints that it was thought that the Church Council of Lyons would handle it. It didn't. Pope Innocent IV published a papal bull to the clergy in defense of the friars and the protection of the order. Now, at the University of Paris, that's where things really heated up. The secular priests felt that the friars had too many chairs of theology, too many chairs in the university. So the students were seeking out the friars as teachers because they were good teachers. In 1253, the University of Paris excluded both the Dominicans and the Franciscans, and the friars appealed to Rome. Now, John of Parma here in 1253 is still the Minister General. So John of Parma went to the University of Paris and in front of all revoked the appeal, right? So this is the humility of John of Parma. So the University of Paris is not giving the Dominicans or the Franciscans any chairs of theology. So they appeal to Rome. John of Parma goes to the university and says, no, I repeal this. We are not appealing to Rome. We're not. So the university aligned themselves with the secular clergy in order to do away with the mendicants. Now it became dangerous. Now the very existence of the mendicant orders was in danger in the church. Pope Innocent IV principally named to his tribunal William St. Amour, a staunch enemy of the mendicant orders. Okay? Gerard of Borgo Sandonino, he published this book called Introduction to the Eternal Gospel, and it was filled with Joachimism. It was attributed to the Dominicans, and the seculars used it against the friars. And so there came a papal bull, Esti Animarum, Esti Animarum, E-S-T-I, and Animarum, E-N-I-M-A-R-U-M, Esti Animarum, by Pope Innocent IV, July 4th, 1254. Now, this papal bull addressed the abuses the friars were being accused of and denounced for it. So this forbade the friars under pain of excommunication to, 1, receive faithful in their churches on Sundays and feasts. Okay? So this papal bull said you can't go to a Franciscan church on Sundays and feasts. 2nd, the friars were forbidden to preach before a solemn mass in a parish or episcopal city where the bishop himself was going to preach. All right, so if there was a friar, he's going to the episcopal city, or he's going to a solemn mass, and the bishop is going to be there. Well, he can't preach that day if the bishop's going to preach that day. You know, no competition. 3rd, the friars could preach in a parish near confessions, in a parish without the permission of a pastor. Ooh, that could hurt. 4th, when the faithful are buried in a Franciscan church, a canonical share had to be given to the local pastor. So if someone was going to be buried in a Franciscan church or cemetery, what was given to the friars, a share of that had to go to the diocesan pastor. So, now the next pope, Alexander IV, right? It's about Alexander IV. He suspended the bull Esti Animarum and ordered the University of Paris to give back the chairs of theology to the friars. And the Pope promised an in-depth study of the University of Paris. So secularists took this as another opportunity to get the mendicants. So in 1254, the resistance against the mendicants became unified. The secular clergy wanted the friars done with. Dominicans, Carmelites, Franciscans, a whole lot of them, gone. That was the idea. So bishops with the secular clergy of the University of Paris sought the ruination of the orders and sought to demonstrate it. Basically a question of mendicant right to exist. It was a question of the illegitimacy of the mendicants' apostolic ministry, the fallacy of their privileges. Like they were going to go after the mendicant orders, and they're going to go after them full force. Now this attack was headed by William St. Amour. In 1255, he published a work cautioning the faithful against mendicants who were precursors to the Antichrist. That's how serious William St. Amour took this. He did not like the mendicants one bit and called them precursors to the Antichrist. So that tells you his thinking on the matter. He said there are only two categories of people in the church. There were monks and secular clergy. He said that the friars had no right to preach or live off alms. He said, imitate Christ in works, not begging. Neither Christ nor his apostles practiced begging. And then he said he wanted to forbid friars to preach and teach anywhere, anytime, just cut them off. And he wanted to forbid friars to beg or receive alms, So now a young doctor of theology took up the fight against William St. Amour with the work. He wrote a book called The Defense of the Mendicants. And this was Saint Bonaventure of Bagnoregio. Before he was elected Minister General, he wrote a book called The Defense of the Mendicants to defend the order against William St. Amour. Thomas Aquinas himself, who taught with Bonaventure, also wrote his Defense of the Mendicants. I forget the exact name of it right now, but he had his own. So Pope Alexander IV took up a study of William's works, and 4 cardinals were sent to Paris with collaborators. William St. Amour, Humbert on one side, right? On the other side was Humbert of Romans, the Dominican Minister General. And then you had Thomas Aquinas, St. Albert the Great, John of Parma, the Franciscan General, and St. Bonaventure on the other side. So think of those teams. William St. Amour is taking on St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Albert the Great, St. Bonaventure, Blessed John of Parma, and Humbert of Romans. He's taking on at least 2 to 3 of the greatest minds in the history of the church, this William St. Amour. So prior to the debate, Thomas Aquinas had torn apart William's positions with his own work, Contra Impugnantes Dei Cultum. Contra Impugnantes Dei Cultum. On October of 1255, Pope Alexander IV solemnly approved the idea of the mendicants. The friars won the day. The mendicants won the debate. Go figure. Alexander the Great, Thomas Aquinas, Albert the Great, Thomas Aquinas, and Bonaventure defeated him so bad that the Pope actually exiled William St. Amour. He sent him off to England, and he was not allowed to come back from where he was. Okay? I should say that it wasn't the Pope who did it. I'm sorry, let me back that up. So it was actually St. Louis of France who banished William St. Amour from France. Now, the dummy should have thought about the fact that he's taking on the mendicant orders in the University of Paris, and the King of France happens to be a Third Order Franciscan. So let's just say that King Louis was not too happy with William St. Amour attacking the mendicants, of which he was a Third Order member. And so when the debate was over, the mendicant orders were exonerated. William St. Amour was banished from France, and Bonaventure and Aquinas were to be given their chairs at the University of Paris. Okay? All right. Let's look at just real briefly, and then we'll end this particular section. St. Bonaventure's main points of defense. So Bonaventure, in defending the mendicants, as part of his presentation to defend the mendicants, he said, first, voluntary poverty is the highest form of evangelical perfection. Voluntary poverty is the highest form of evangelical perfection. And where does he get this from? He gets it from the rich young man who came to Jesus and said, what good must I do? Good master, what must I do to enter the kingdom of heaven? Jesus tells him to obey the commandments. He said, I've done that. And the Lord says, one thing you lack. If you wish to be perfect, go sell all you have, give it to the poor, then come follow me. The evangelical counsel of poverty is given as a way of perfection. So Bonaventure says voluntary poverty is the highest form of evangelical perfection, and he bases that upon the gospel passage of the rich young man. Second, Bonaventure says the preaching and teaching of the gospel is done best by those who practice it. And so he's trying to say that we practice it, we live it, we profess it, the gospel. And so the teaching of the gospel, the preaching of the gospel is best done by those who live it. And then he says that the friars were given the right to preach by the Pope himself. So he's defending this right of the friars to preach anywhere, anytime, because it was the Pope that gave this permission. And he said the Pope is the first pastor, then the bishop, then the pastor of the parish, then the local priest, to whom any of these pastors might delegate this function. And the friars had the delegation from the first pastor, the Pope. The friars, and this, I think this is great, because this really pulls together Bonaventure's mentality, which is why when Bonaventure becomes the minister general, he brings a peacefulness between the friars and the secular clergy with this line. And I think it's important for us Franciscans for us to really consider how Bonaventure explains the ministry of the friars. He says, the friars are like the men in the other boat, whom the apostles call over to help bring in the fish. So he sees the apostles as, the diocesan clergy as, the apostles in the boat. And the boat's too full, they call over the other boat to come help. Right? The friars are the men in the other boat who come over to help the diocesan clergy bring in the fish. I think that's the best example and model for Franciscan ministry. That we have to see ourselves as the men in the other boat that help and assist the local clergy, not working against them. Okay? All right. And then he said the friars were entitled to live by the gospel and beg. They were entitled to live by the gospel and beg. And he's basing that on, once again, the call to voluntary poverty, the call to live in poverty like Christ. Unfortunately, the one thing that Bonaventure did not like to do, or I guess he did manual labor himself, but he said manual labor is unsuitable for persons engaged in spiritual direction. That's debatable. I don't agree with St. Bonaventure on everything, most things. Just on a couple of points, I would have some disagreements with him. Like manual labor is unsuitable for persons engaged in spiritual direction. Manual labor is an incredible part of our Franciscan vocation and our call. Remember how St. Francis wrote in his testament that he worked with his hands, and he always wanted to work with his hands, and he desired that all the brothers should work with their hands. Manual labor is something that should be done by all the friars, whether they are engaged in the pastoral ministry or not. Whether one is a priest or a brother. There's no reason why the priest of the friary can also be the cook. St. Anthony of Padua was assigned by St. Francis at one of the chapters to be a cook at a friary. That's before he was a preacher. It was only while he was cook that the superior of the house couldn't get one of the other brothers to go preach at the Dominicans' ordination, and so he asked Anthony of Padua to preach at the ordination, and that began Anthony's preaching career. But Anthony of Padua had no problem doing manual labor, and neither did our early brothers, And so we should always keep in mind that manual labor is an essential part of the life, And but anyway, so William St. Amour, we haven't heard the last of him. From exile, he'll still cause more problems and be difficult with the order. But we see the order now coming to the year of 1257. It's now 31 years after Francis's death. 31 years later, and we've had all this history of all this bopping around, and we see the deterioration of the living of the charism, the deterioration of the gift that Francis gave to the order and the gift of the charism. Or should we say the gift that Christ gave to the church through St. Francis to the order, the gift of our charism. We see how the privileges and the exemptions, it caused tension within the church itself, the friars against the clergy. It affected the university relationships, but also affected the friars in their own life, because not only was there division within secular clergy, there was division within the order. Those who wanted exemption of privileges, what Francis gave, lived in those conventual friaries, and those who wanted to observe the rule as Francis had given it were living in the smaller hermitage friaries. And we have these two groups developing within the order. We have the conventuali, those who nicknamed to live in the conventual friaries, who wanted those relaxations of privileges and all the other stuff, who wanted nice things, and who would just say, well, the church owns it, we don't own it, we just use it. And the spirituali, the spirituals, wanted to observe the rule radically, using the Testament alone as the commentary on the rule, who wanted to use things that were few, poor, and necessary. one through the apostolic work in the way that Francis had originally intended for us. And so now we have these two groups developing in the order. Okay? And so, and a lot of tension. So in our next class, we'll pick up on the Generalate of Saint Bonaventure and its consequences, and we'll see the years 1257 to 1274 and all that happened during the time frame of Bonaventure, and talk a bit about him and his influence on the order. It was very good. Let's just say Bonaventure was the great peacemaker, or the great pacifier, just a great gift to the church, a doctor of the church, and supposed to be studied equal to that of Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas is not the only guy to be studied. It's also Bonaventure. But we'll talk about that later. So, all right, we'll stop here and pick up in our next class on St. Bonaventure as we continue on our way through Franciscan history. We're only 30 years in. We got another 770 years to go. All right. God bless you all.